Well, here we go again, as I already said too many times. Uh, this is a report about a trip to Tibet. There were 12 of us. We called ourselves the Holy Molies, and we traveled through the country for 3.5 weeks. We had an industrial-strength India bus, 2 monk drivers, and a guide. Our meditation teacher, who designed the itinerary, was not allowed into the country due to the arbitrary ruling of the Chinese colonial authority. So we were on our own, but we had a good guide. We were working with a Tibetan travel company and stayed mostly in Tibetan facilities and ate in Tibetan restaurants, though there was some overlap in some Chinese places. But we were clearly there for the Tibetans. We were clearly on pilgrimage, and we made no effort to hide that fact. We'd bow in front of the temples and do other pilgrimage type of activities, which the colonial authorities did not like, but we had the tourist immunity, and after all, they wanted to increase the amount of tourism in Tibet. So even though there was an uneasy atmosphere below the window dressing that had been carefully designed, and we were very well treated both by the Tibetan Travel Company and by the Chinese colonial authorities. They pretty much left us alone, though we were being watched the whole time, and we had to file our itinerary. Our route was to get on an airplane in Kathmandu. We'd been there a couple of days. We were getting assimilated to the Asian atmosphere. We got on a plane and flew across the Himalayas. Well, it was cloudy that day, so we didn't see much of the Himalayas, but they did loom out of the cloud banks a time or two. Incredible mountains, those. Soon we were flying over high desert, a little bit of green here and there, but mostly rocky, and that, in fact, is how Tibet is. Very rocky, very hilly, and mountainous. I should mention I don't have permission to use the pictures or stories of the other 11 people. They'll have to tell their own story at a different time. We bonded heavily. We had a lot of common experiences, but there were also 12 different journeys combined at the same time. And all I can do is describe my journey, what I experienced. I hope this is useful to people that are interested in Tibet and the goings-on in Tibet, because it's a worm's eye view of the overall situation. We did not see any concentration camps. We did not see Chinese soldiers. There was a big base, which I stumbled across, that was blocks long, but they kept their military in the background. Things were peaceful, but again there was an underlying tension. The Tibetans are very much up against it and pretty distraught with the situation. The cultural genocide that's being perpetrated is really regrettable. The forced assimilation, as it were, of Tibet into the Chinese fold, as if Tibetans were Han Chinese, which they're clearly not. I'm not going to get too far into the political opinion side of things, except to say that the Tibetans are in a similar situation now as the American Indians were maybe 100 years ago. Their language is being suppressed. Their culture is being attacked. Their spiritual life is being shattered or attempted to be shattered. So this is the background. All of this however, was sub rosa, under the table. Overtly, everything went beautifully, smoothly. The Tibetan Travel Company were highly competent. They took care of us. There were two camping trips embedded in the itinerary, and they supplied yak trains and horses and people to man the kitchen and so on. So we had a pretty extensive infrastructure backing us up. The rest of the time we were on that bus going from place to place, seeing some amazing things. It's hard to encapsulate what it was. We get glimmers of what it was. Even though there was a concerted effort, especially during the Cultural Revolution, to destroy the Dharma in Tibet, there was so much of it that all they could do was damage it a bit. Now, all this took place in August of 2007, and if the news is any indication, things have not gotten any better in Tibet since then. They arbitrarily close the borders whenever there's trouble, and then reopen the borders to tourists when things are calm, and that's been the pattern for some years now. I have no idea what's going on in there currently, but unfortunately the trend is pretty obvious. They're being inundated by settlers. Lhasa itself, the sacred city of Tibet, is looking more like Chinatown all the time. There's one small Tibetan neighborhood that's intact and a few small neighborhoods that are intact. The rest of it is all glass and steel and neon. Every corporate logo that you can imagine is to be found in Lhasa. However, we were visiting what was left of old Tibet, and that was our focus. When we first arrived, of course, we went to the Jokong. The Jokong is the most sacred building in Tibet, and it's been in existence for centuries. It, I hear, had a fire recently. I don't know how badly damaged it was, but at the time it was still intact, though it had a museum ticket that was sometimes enforced, so that you had to buy your way into the sacred space as a tourist. The Jokong has a feeling of venerable ancientness about it. It's very dark in there, and there are shrines and statues and hangings all over the place. It's really quite extraordinary. I hope it's still intact. On the 15th of the month, they have a gathering in the Jokong, celebrating the full moon. And we went there separately. The time I went there, I was in a line in the space, a bunch of devotees going through the space. The fellow in front of me was carrying some lard, and that was butter for the butter lamps, and it was his offering. And it wasn't of very much material value, but it was extremely valuable in terms of the devotional energy behind it. And similarly for the rest of the people in that line. However, there were two uniformed Chinese soldiers prancing about, rushing the crowd, hurry up, treating them like cattle, humiliation. One of the officers made a whole series of nonsense syllables, and at first I laughed and thought, this is a good non-dual deconstruction of the mantra art. And then I realized he had no idea of non-duality. He was just mocking the Tibetans. One of the soldiers was going along the line trying to hurry people up and slapped me on the butt. It was dark. I don't think I think he didn't realize I wasn't Tibetan. So I got a little taste of the level of humiliation that the Tibetans go through on a daily basis. There's a circumambulation route outside of the Jokong that we use several times. People walk in a circle in a ritual way, and I joined that Kora, they called it, that circumambulation a lot of different days. And there was one incident that indicated the veil got a little bit thin in terms of keeping up appearances. I was walking the Kora, and a gentleman was sitting next to the walking route and saw me, got up, and walked over and walked straight in front of me, very close, and gave me a huge sneer. Obviously, undercover police. And the message was clear: we don't like what you're doing. We may tolerate it, but we don't like it. So watch your stuff. And of course we did. Watch our P's and Q's pretty carefully. It was a definite adventure, and mostly a positive one. I remember one time being in the Jokong, and I was just hugging one of the other pilgrims, and we were weeping. And it was one of those binds. It's like we both realized, okay, we're here in this sacred space. But the only reason we're here is because of the Chinese invasion in 1950. Because if they hadn't opened Tibet, there'd be no way to travel there. It was very closed before then. So the emotional distance between what we were experiencing and what the Tibetans had experienced as a result, it was just too much. There's something else about our journey that was too much. It was nonstop. It was a whirlwind tour. Everything was extremely cleverly designed. We'd have our large heaps of baggage piled up at the beginning of the day, and it would get loaded into the bus, and away we'd go to the next destination. The interaction with the Tibetan people was a little bit problematic. The problem being, if you get too chummy with any one Tibetan, they're going to be interrogated later. So there was that natural distance that we had to keep back and not interact so directly most of the time. There were informal times. The kids were great. One time we had the yak train was a day late, so we had a down day. People went into town, bought all the beer at the village, right? And the village kids came out, about a dozen of them. And they were running freely through the camp and sitting down, imbibing the exotic vibrations of the Westerners, so to speak. Charming, and very much kids. Even though there was no language in common, we brought them pens and paper and other good things, so they were glad to see us. When we first got to Lhasa, the air seemed really thin. Partly we were at 12,000 feet and not used to the thin air. The equivalent of the 7-Eleven in the hotel, Yak Hotel, carried oxygen bottles. And the first day I think I used one, but after that I adapted reasonably well. If you get altitude sickness, if you get it very bad, the only solution is to descend to a lower altitude, which would mean going back to Nepal. But luckily none of us caught the bad case of altitude sickness. We were just slightly uncomfortable some of the time. And when we separated, I had walking pneumonia, so I couldn't go on the trek. Went back to Lhasa with the bus driver. That was at 14,000 feet we were camping, and I was okay. But the people on the trek had to camp at 17,000 one time, and they said everybody had a miserable night. So even at the end of our stay, when we were fairly acclimatized, we'd grown some extra red blood cells. Little lung capacity was extended. We'd go up 2 flights of stairs and be wiped out on the 3rd flight. So there was a constant shortness of breath to deal with. Other than that, our journey was physically pretty comfortable, if you don't mind sitting on a bus for hours. We had good accommodations. Again, everything was on time. The Tibetan Travel Company knew where the restaurants were, knew where the stops on our itinerary were. So we had a very pleasant time. And I got to thank the Chinese colonial authority for allowing that to take place, because it really was a major life-changing event for all 12 of us. Well, as to the food, since it was high desert, there's not many critters. And so we had no problem with dysentery or anything of that sort. The food was pretty simple. A standard Tibetan fare is like a few steamed vegetables tossed on top of rice, a little bit bland and a little bit hard to digest. What we found in the restaurants, it was a Chinese restaurant, there was high quality Chinese food. If it was a Tibetan restaurant, we'd often order what's called the Nepali plate, which is something that they got from Nepal style, and it was quite good. Very nourishing. And again, the venues in the restaurants were pleasant, they were clean. The bathrooms were always a problem. Most of the bathrooms consisted of a hole in the floor with running water. So you'd shit in the hole and then wash some water down the hole. And it was awkward to squat in those places, but we managed. The accommodations were rustic, but plenty sufficient and quite comfortable. The efficiency of the Tibetan Travel Company truly amazed me. They had the timing down exactly, and everything was in rhythm. After 3.5 weeks, though, we were totally exhausted because it had been non-stop except for that one down day when the yak train was a day late. When we were in Lhasa, we went to the famous Drepung Monastery. It was the largest monastery on the planet at one time. It had 10,000 monks. Now there are 700 left, but they're practicing hard, those 700, and they were open to our presence. They continued their devotions. I heard some very nice devotional tunes as they chanted in Tibetan the various liturgies that are common among the Tibetan Buddhists. There was rapport there, but again a certain distance. And when we went to the monastery of Ganden, we camped below the monastery, and they were aware of our presence, but they didn't really engage. They were definitely doing their monastic thing. So monasticism is endangered but intact in Tibet. And likewise, an incredible amount of artifacts, paintings, sculptures, really good art. A lot of it survived the Cultural Revolution. Some of it was hidden in caves during the time that they were actively destroying things. And there's so much Dharma in Tibet that they simply couldn't destroy it all. It'll take 3 generations if they have that much time, which I doubt. The first time we went out of Lhasa, we went to the monastery of Reting. Reting is the home monastery of the regent for the Dalai Lama. The Reting Rinpoche is routinely the regent during the time that the Dalai Lama is still a child. They had the new incarnation of the Reting Rinpoche in a house below the monastery, and they were re-educating him. So he was not getting much Dharma, even though he was the reincarnation of the Reting Rinpoche. He was getting a lot of propaganda, and they were grooming him for the next fake Dalai Lama, which they have in the works. They want a puppet, and the Reting Rinpoche is key in that endeavor, since he's traditionally the regent, as we said. The monks at Reting were very cordial, very hard practicing. It was a joy to be there. They had simple rooms available to us, lots of wood. There was a forest around there, a juniper forest, which is pretty unusual for Tibet. There are not many trees there. But the juniper trees were all over the place, as well as the stupas and the usual trappings of a remote monastery. The food was very simple but tasty. The meditation hall was open to us, and I did some sitting in there. I'm not sure if the other people did as well. And again, in a poker-faced way, they pointed out the house where the Reting Rinpoche was under house arrest, basically, as a child monk. So again, below the surface, things are not all that shiny, but on the surface, everything works smoothly. Trains are on time, so to speak. I still have a fond place in my heart for the energy there at Reting, because in spite of the circumstances, there was a lot of Dharma happening. It has a distinct energy. We were very grateful to have spent some time there. At that point, we went to Ganden, and as I say, we camped below the monastery. The yak train arrived the next day. No, it arrived that day. The yak train simply grazed while we slept. And then in the morning, it assembled, and away they went, 4 days worth of trekking. And as I said, I had walking pneumonia, so I had really no choice but to go back to Lhasa with the bus driver. And that's one time when the travel company really came through for me. I got back to the Yak Hotel, which we had just left, and my luggage was piled in the lobby there. I went up to the desk and said, I need a room for 4 days. And they said, okay, where's your visa? And I said, well, my visa is on the way to Samye with a trek. It's a group visa for 12 of us. And they said, oh, well, we can't give you a room if you don't have a visa. And I'm going, uh-oh. And all kinds of negative possibilities began to arise, right? What am I going to do? I can't even move my luggage alone, let alone deal with the streets of Lhasa at night. And amazingly enough, one of the honchos from the travel company, which had offices in the hotel, came through the lobby at that moment, saw what was going on, and said, no, he's all right, give him a room. And bullied the ladies at the desk into giving me a room, and to save face, they said, well, we'll give you a room, but you have to pay the 4 days in advance. And I said, yes, I will do that right away, and made a beeline for the bank, got some money out of the bank, paid the 4 days, and got my room. What a relief. Then I had 4 days to spend in Lhasa. The intent was to see as much as possible and to stay out of trouble. And both of those pretty much transpired. One of the things I did is to go into the Chinese area, to the Tibet Museum, which was assembled under Chinese auspices. And I told the people at the desk, I want to go to the Tibet Museum. The woman wrote a few Chinese characters on a paper and said, show this to the taxi driver. So I got a taxi, showed it to the taxi driver, and there I am at the Tibet Museum. I go up the long flight of stairs, go in, and they say, where's your ticket? And I said, I want to buy a ticket. And I said, well, the ticket booth is down at the bottom of that long flight of stairs. And I said, okay, and I turned around to go back down the stairs to buy the ticket, and then they unctuously approached me and said, we have decided to give you free admission to this museum. And thank you very much. Again, they were aiming to please all of the Chinese workers in public, the restaurant people and the museum people and so on, were all scripted to be very polite, but there was a feeling of an agenda behind the politeness. I went into a tea house one time, wanted a cup of tea, and I was served by 5 people, right? 2 of them in suits, and I got my tea, and then they wanted to sell me a exotic, very expensive tea, which I refused. No, I'm good. This tea is just fine. So I sipped my tea, and the whole atmosphere was a bit of a cultural boggle. It's like I couldn't really tell where they were coming from, and yet it was a common situation. I'm in a restaurant having tea, but the energy was strange. Likewise, I'm walking along, and astoundment of astoundments, I find a coffee shop, and this is designed like a Starbucks. There was nobody in it except me, and I bought my coffee and rested from my long walk. But the feeling was strange. This is like a teleportation of a Starbucks into Lhasa. And most of the Tibetans and Chinese drink tea, not coffee. So there were only 2 places in Lhasa I knew of where you could get coffee. Some habits die hard. I drank a lot of tea in Tibet and loved it. The situation with the money was pretty straightforward. It was Chinese yen. There was a standard exchange rate. The prices were highly reasonable. I don't remember having either sticker shock or feeling that it was way underpriced. It seemed like a reasonable price for what we were getting. And most of the meals were included in the travel company's package. And it was very expensive to employ that travel company, but they were worth every penny of it because they made the whole journey possible. And of course they had to walk a delicate line. They had to appease the Chinese authorities, which they did. I mean, they did their job perfectly well. They welcomed the tourists and served us well. But once we were there, it's like everything had been worked out in a really efficient and timely way. The result was we could do a whirlwind tour and have a non-stop view of everything that there was time for. And it was only 3.5 weeks. We covered the central part of Tibet, U and Tsang. When I got to the Chinese museum, as I say, they let me in for free. The first thing I ran into was a older Chinese gentleman, very elegant, who was looking at a display of the um, evolution of the human species from Homo erectus and so on up to the present time. Then I had a brief interaction with that gentleman. He was very impressive. Old style, he looked like some Confucian or Taoist out of the 200 years ago. That was how he was dressed. Then the next exhibit I skipped, a little bit of contempt prior to investigation. It was a presentation of the Chinese case why Tibet is a part of China. And they do have a case, but it's a pretty weak case. And to get to the place where Tibetans and Chinese were one people, you'd have to go back 60 or so minimum centuries to a time when the languages were the same. And they've been separate peoples since a long time ago. In any case, I skipped that exhibit. I was there for the for the Tibetan antiquities. And, later if I want to visit China, I'll visit China. What we were doing was visiting Tibetans. A similar thing happened to my visit with the Maya. I wasn't there visiting Mexicans, I was there visiting Maya. And then later interacted with the Mexicans. So it was a similar thing here. We were clearly there for the Tibetans. That was understood. That's what tourists do. We're looking for exotic Tibetan customs and practices. And the fact that we were serious about doing those exotic practices was not palatable to the authorities. But as I say, they simply watched and decided to leave us be, for which we're grateful. It made for a really good tourist experience, so I would recommend it if you happen to be interested in traveling in Tibet. Wait for a time when it's open. They prefer group visas. They're easier to get than single visas. And you have to file an itinerary. There are a lot of places in Tibet that the tourists are not allowed to go. Well, we found besides postcards, there were a lot of vendors. On most of the mountain passes, there would be a couple of vendors. Yeah, there were gift shops in the monasteries. I've got a couple of small items that I bought. I didn't have much money available, so I didn't buy many of the goods. They had some very, very nice Tibetan ritual objects for sale, probably for a fair amount of money. And they're such good horse traders that I tended to keep back from the vendors because you get drawn in and probably you're going to end up buying something. And there are postcards and stamps in the shops. There was one place that was run by nomads, and they were selling replica Kampa jewelry, but it was replica. In 1985, when they first opened Tibet to tourists, people tell me that they were able to buy the real thing, that there were Kampas about selling their turquoise and whatnot. But again, by the time we were there, that mostly had gone away, and there were a lot of replicas for sale. But there was some real stuff with the vendors, but as I say, I didn't want to engage them because they're too astute. And I didn't have much discretionary income at that point. The journey was very expensive. I think it was $5,000 to set up with the travel company, almost all expenses paid. So again, it was worth every penny of it, but it was a struggle. When I got to the good part of the Chinese Tibetan Museum, I saw some marvelous artifacts, really old stuff, beautifully crafted ritual objects, tankas, paintings on paper with brocade mountings. There was a lovely applique tanka of Vajrayogini, a large one, very carefully sewn into place, all the little pieces of fabric that made up the picture. There were other good things in that museum. There was a tendency, however, for things to be desacralized. People probably have heard of the Potala. The Potala is the winter palace of the Dalai Lamas. And it's a huge building on a hill. 1,000 rooms, they say it has. They gave us exactly 1 hour in there. And there was a prearranged route. It didn't cover the roof, so we didn't see the place where the Dalai Lama had his telescope watching the crowds below. And there was a feeling that while the physical objects were still there, that they'd somehow lost some of their spiritual potency by way of being defiled. I mean, this was a museum, not a sacred space anymore. The exception was the 2 tombs of the Dalai Lamas that I saw, the tomb of the 5th and the tomb of the 7th. They were very large structures, a story and a half high in a big room, and it still had the energy of sacredness about it, after all those centuries. I was especially moved by the tomb of the 7th Dalai Lama, which had an energy about it that was beautiful. This problem of desacralization, of course, is pretty widespread. When we got to Shigatse, the second largest city in Tibet, there's a monastery there called Tashi Lumpo. They're very materially abundant, but pretty much totally compliant with whatever the Chinese colonial agenda is. The Panchen Lama's palace, beautiful murals on the walls, painted walls, with all of these traditional pictures. But the place had the feeling of being spiritually dead. And you know that 100 years ago that place was pulsing with some kind of good energy. So a lot has been lost. What's amazing is how much has remained, at least in 2007. I think the strategy is a waiting game. They're forcing the children to learn Chinese and suppressing the language, which is, again, what happened to the Native Americans in this country after the European invasion. A lot of parallels there. When I was done with the Chinese Museum, I went back out to the area in front, and there was a pedicab driver there who wanted me for a fare. And I remember connecting with a Lama that happened to be there, and I was unsure whether I needed to do that, but the Lama indicated, yeah, that's a good thing to do. And it turned out that the museum was very far from the Tibetan neighborhood where the Yak Hotel was. And he got about 2/3 the way there, and he was really tiring, and indicated he expected a really big tip for this trip, because it was way long for a pedicab driver to go. But we got there, and he was tired but not exhausted, and I gave him a very large tip. I'm sure it was the talk of pedicab circles for a while. That was the one time that I paid a lot more than was required by the situation. Usually the situation would present itself, and how much had to be paid was indicated. And there's not a whole lot of bargaining that has going on there. The prices are fairly well fixed. Like if you're in Morocco, you have to haggle, and you have to learn to haggle well. And again, the vendors were into horse trading mode, and people bought a few things, but I think it was a little disappointing. There were not that many tourists, and they weren't doing much business there. Then on another day, I had my 4 days in Lhasa. On another day, I decided to take the long pilgrimage. This is something that I found in an old guidebook. It's no longer well marked, but you can take a short circumambulation around a temple, keeping the stupa or the temple to your right, circulating that way. And then there was a large pilgrimage circuit that went behind the Jokong, through a whole bunch of neighborhoods. Again, not well marked. I had to keep asking, where's the Chakpur? I used the Iron Mountain where the Tibetan Medical College was. The PLA used it for target practice, so they destroyed the whole mountaintop. Again, the medical college had been there for centuries. And that was the landmark, and I was using it to sight off of, because the route in the guidebook went around the Chakpuri and then around the back of the Potala. So I kept asking, and I got where I needed to go. At one point, I came to a large wall, and I walked along that wall for about 2 blocks, maybe more. And I came to a hole in the wall, a little entranceway, and there was a Chinese soldier standing guard, eyes front, completely at attention. I'm sure he was aware of my presence, but gave no indication. So I walked past him and walked along another few blocks of wall. It was a huge military base in the middle of Lhasa. Obviously not something you could easily visit. Not that I would want to, but there it was. Then I got to the Potala. Along the side of the Potala, there's a lot of prayer wheels. And sure enough, there's another undercover agent. And this guy was dressed out in Tibetan standard. He had a huge prayer wheel, a mala sticking out of his shirt pocket, and it was obviously totally phony. So I took his picture and then proceeded to turn the prayer wheels. And when I got to the back of the Potala, there were a whole number of devotees back there. And it was an amazing interaction. Again, I couldn't approach them closely. There was a feeling of wariness, like, what's this guy doing? You know, obviously not working for them. And there were niches along the back wall of the Potala with statues in them, little cement statues. And people were bonking their head against the wall in front of the statues as a means of devotion. And I just followed along and did what the other devotees were doing, and I think they appreciated my gesture, even though, as I say, there was no direct engagement, because it was just not safe for those guys to talk with the Westerners in that way. So I got back to Jokang, completed that circuit. Eventually, the 4 days were up. The bus driver and I hooked back up. We went down to the river, to the big Tsangpo, the Brahmaputra River, and waited on dockside, and the other 11 holy moles had visited the sacred monastery of Samye, which has been rebuilt. Beautiful place. I've seen the pictures. And they crossed the river, and we met up on the other side and went into the town of Tsetang. And boy, were those people tired. That was a hell of a 4-day trek. But they bounced back fast, and the next day we went to the Yarlung River Valley, and up to a oldest building in Tibet, an old fortress up on a hill. The hill was fairly steep, and the entrepreneurs were there. The place had several animals. There was a camel and a yak and horses, and you could rent these animals to carry you up to the top of the hill where the fortress was. And I decided to rent a yak. So I'm riding on this yak, and it is the sweetest creature. You know, they're much much better temperament than cattle. And it was so tired of going up that hill. It just didn't want to do it anymore. It was hesitating. It made me sad that that animal was captive in that way. Then we got back to Zedong, had an overnight in a Chinese-run hotel, the Pigeon, I think it was called. And then in the morning, our baggage was piled up in the lobby again, and away we go, a long bus ride to the town of Gyanse. Gyanse figures largely in history. It was the town that the British occupied when they invaded in 1904, trying to open Tibet for the trade routes. They wanted to trade in Tibet, so they opened it forcefully. And there was a big battle at Gyanse, but Tibetans didn't have guns, so they just got mowed down. It was pathetic. Anyway, it became a trading capital, and then when times changed, it became an economic backwater. And the advantage of being a backwater is that it didn't have a whole lot of brand new Chinese buildings in it. The Tibetan feeling of the town was pretty well intact. It had a monastery with a stupa beside it, and in the stupa were statues of various deities. I had studied the iconography before we went, and so I was familiar with most of the iconographic figures, the standard ones that are in the books. What astounded me with the statues and paintings that I saw in Tibet were unfamiliar. They were of obscure deities. There were all kinds of special forms. I took pictures of some of them, and I, in most cases, still don't know what deities those pictures represented. It's a very complicated iconographical system in Tibetan Buddhism. It's amazing to see that much good art, sacred art. Anyway, there was a lot of that in Gyanse, a lot of vendors, as I said, whom we didn't serve very well. There was a fortress there that the British had occupied. Some of the people went up to it, but it was a very long walk, and I had limited motility, due to my reaction to the altitude, so there's no way I was going to climb that hill. So I missed out on a few things that way. But what I saw was enough to change my consciousness considerably. They had artifacts all over the place, and part of the tourist circuit is these quaint Tibetan monks will bless you with the shoe of an ancient lama or whatever, the hat of an ancient lama. So they kept those ritual forms in place for the tourists. And likewise, tourists are good for the Tibetans because they allow a certain amount of the Dharma to continue to be practiced. So it was a win-win situation in that sense anyway, as we got exposed to all kinds of venerable old artifacts of various sorts. And they were able to perform some of their monastic functions as lamas as a result of having tourists there to serve. So it worked out beautifully in that sense. But again, there's a feeling that the rest of the Dharma in Tibet is still endangered, and they're chipping away at it. The agenda is still to destroy the Dharma in Tibet and to create a fake tourist Dharma which should satisfy the needs of the Tourist Bureau. So that's where that sits. I think probably to leave it at Gyanse, and the memory of the town has a good feeling. not like Shigatse. Enough said for the moment. I hope that was useful to someone. It was surprisingly hard to fish out all those memories in a way that's a little bit coherent, at least. The memories are kind of stacked up in a jumble, even yet after years. It's amazing. I'm so grateful that I was able to go on that journey. Enough said, I think.